Young man, let me tell you something. In the air, I am responsible for this aircraft and the lives of all on board her. And neither you nor anyone else, including the chairman of the corporation, is going to induce me to take her 1 inch off the ground until I'm absolutely satisfied she's in perfect order. Do I make myself clear?
Those lines could have been written for Captain Stanley Key. Key was a decorated wartime pilot, later a training captain. But among younger colleagues, he was seen as brusque, overbearing, a stickler for discipline. Captain Key flew for British European Airways, later to become part of the giant British Airways. In 1972, BEA's younger pilots were fighting for more pay and were prepared to disrupt flights to make their point, a tactic which enraged some senior captains, among them Stanley Key. That afternoon, in the crew restroom, Key had a furious outburst with a junior pilot. A witness described it as the most violent argument I have ever heard. The effects on Key were to be even more dramatic. An hour later, he left to take his flight to Brussels.
Key was a very senior pilot, and he was renowned to be a very good operator and a stickler for correct operation. The other 2 pilots were both quite junior by comparison. In fact, the co-pilot was only 22, very young, very inexperienced, and Key was somewhat suspicious of the abilities of these younger pilots. He was known to be a rather brusque character, and with these very young co-pilots with him, the atmosphere would not have been pleasant at all. That kind of environment is not something that would be accepted in this day and age.
As Trident Papa India took off for Brussels that Sunday afternoon, the atmosphere on the flight deck was poisonous.
BEA.
Investigators found graffiti scrawled on the tray table of the junior pilots seated behind Key. Two minutes after takeoff, Captain Key's last flight was over. The Trident fell to earth in a field near the town of Staines. Incredibly, although the field was alongside a crowded main road, the crash at first went almost unnoticed. Local residents were on the scene before police and firemen were even alerted, but there were no survivors. Soon, news of the crash spread on radio and television. Traffic jams built up on the main road as hundreds tried to get a glimpse of the carnage.
Come on, get back! That guy's got to be dead, Lama. Come on, move!
It was my first major accident that I'd seen, and being what I call a Trident man, it was, and knowing the crews, it was very horrific for me initially, and then it became an interesting job trying to decipher what had happened.
When Ray Davis arrived and began to examine the wreckage, he made a disturbing discovery. There was something very odd about the wings. On jet aircraft, the wings are narrow and swept back so they can fly fast at altitude. But that means that at low speed, such as during takeoffs, they don't generate enough lift. To cope with this, most planes have flaps on the back of their wings that can be extended to give them more lift. The Trident had that little bit extra. Flaps on the front of the wings too, called droops.
A large amount of lift would be generated by the droops, much larger than the flaps, and so the lift producing qualities of the droops were very good. This is shown up in the fact that the aircraft had to be at 3,000 feet and at the speed of 225 knots with a lot of airflow over the wings before the troops could be brought in.
There was no cockpit voice recorder aboard Papa India, but there was a flight data recorder. It confirmed that a terrible mistake had been made.
Okay, V1, rotate.
Okay, the gear up.
Okay.
Using information recorded in that black box, two of Captain Key's former colleagues, now senior captains for British Airways, show what happened that afternoon.
Climbing through 300 feet.
They lifted off at about 143 knots and climbed fairly rapidly up into the low cloud base which was covering Heathrow at that time. And they immediately experienced a certain amount of discomfort with the wind and the turbulence. And at 90 seconds, the co-pilot would have cut the power back and raised the flaps.
The heading is to turn left towards Epsom.
At about that same time, they would be starting the left turn, which is part of the noise abatement departure. And at some point after that, the droops were raised. And this caused the aircraft to go into an immediate stall. When this droop lever was moved 60 knots too early, there would have been immediately several warnings go off, followed by a stick shaker which warns the pilots by shaking the control column that they were imminently about to stall the aircraft. Immediately afterwards they had a stick push, which is a second level of protection. A ram pushes the control column forward to physically force the aircraft out of the stall position.
Somebody on that flight deck must have then decided that what they were getting was a false stick push situation, because the stick push was actually docked. There's a lever at the back of the console. That was pulled, and then the nose just came up and it went into the deep stall, because now there was nothing to protect it. And it is very easy to look at the graphs of the flight recorder and say, why didn't they do that, this, why didn't they do that? When it happens in real time, there is, in fact, very little time for anybody to recognize anything in a dynamic situation like that.
There was a whole cacophony of sound and light going on, all at once, totally unexpectedly.
The noise continued throughout, as well as the flashing lights, and the confusion must have been enormous.
How could such an experienced pilot have made such a blunder? Or did he? With no voice recorder, investigators could only speculate. Then, a discovery. The pathologist called in by the Accident Investigation Branch began performing post-mortems.
Looking at the captain's coronary arteries under the microscope revealed that he had severe coronary artery disease. There were clearly some changes which were acute changes in the form of hemorrhage into the wall of the coronary artery. Now that hemorrhage could have occurred a few hours before his death, but it's unlikely to be longer than that. Now we're unable to say whether it killed him or not. It is possible that it did lead to his death or unconsciousness or merely incapacitating chest pain.
Did Key, distracted by pain, bark out a confusing command which, because of his domineering personality, was instantly and fatally obeyed? Did he pull the wrong lever himself and no one dared query him? Did he die in his seat at the critical moment? Only a cockpit voice recorder could have given the answer.
This was the one thing which was the pity, that this was the accident where we really did need a cockpit voice recorder. The flight data recorder will tell you what happened. The cockpit voice recorder will often tell you why it happened. And in this particular case, we didn't know that, and nobody could prove exactly what happened. With a CVR, we may have had evidence of a medical condition, we may have had an argument, we may have heard a command which had been misinterpreted, but without the CVR, nobody will ever know for certain. With all the flight data recorder evidence we had and the wreckage evidence, nobody will know for certain what happened on that Trident.
Staines was to prove a turning point in British accident investigation. From then on, cockpit voice recorders became mandatory in all British passenger planes. They are now standard equipment on nearly all the world's commercial aircraft.
London, Heathrow, 1972. Pilots that year at what was then called British European Airways, are in the middle of a bitter and divisive pay dispute. Junior pilots are planning a strike. But many of the airline's older pilots are vehemently opposed to the idea. One of them is Captain Stanley Key, 4 years off retirement and anxious not to rock the boat. That afternoon, Key has a furious row with a younger, militant pilot.
Stanley Key's attitude was that strikes were a dereliction of duty. You had a duty to do, and one thing you did not do is fail in your duty, and your duty was to turn up to work, come what may.
Several hours after the row, Key is rostered on a routine flight to Brussels. With him, on BEA Flight 548, are co-pilot Jeremy Keeley and second officer Simon Ticehurst. As the aircraft climbs out of Heathrow, Key, at the controls, is said to be still fuming from the row. Suddenly, things go wrong. 2.5 minutes into the flight, the aircraft goes into a stall. It passes low over the densely populated town of Staines on the outskirts of London. Seconds later, it smashes into the ground. Almost immediately, sightseers clog the area. All 118 people on board are killed. It's Britain's worst ever air disaster. Within hours, air crash investigators arrive. As they pick through the rubble, they find something very puzzling.
The flight recorder we took away last night rather suggests that something went wrong with the leading edge droop around about 1,800 feet.
Droops are flaps on the front of a jet's wings that extend to provide vital extra lift at low speeds. A Trident must reach 3,000 feet and be flying at 225 knots before the droops can be safely retracted. But the flight data recorder shows that BEA Flight 548 was only flying at 1,800 feet at a speed of 162 knots when the droops were withdrawn. It's much too soon. The plane will have gone into an immediate stall. This was the first error, but it should not have been fatal. Chris Woods is a former Trident pilot and trainer.
The first thing that happens is a warning. This shakes the control column and basically saying to the captain, you are flying too slowly, push the stick forward, which will lower the nose of the aircraft and gather speed.
If the pilot still doesn't respond, a second emergency procedure kicks in.
A ram will push the stick all the way forward and hold it there until the speed has been recovered.
The plane will dive, the speed will pick up, and the stall should be averted. Yet the flight data recorder shows that somebody has overridden these alarms. What had caused Stanley Key, an immensely experienced pilot, to make such a basic error? And why had neither of his crew stopped him? the investigators look at several possibilities. A post-mortem shows Key suffered heart problems. Could the violent row just before takeoff have triggered a sudden stroke? An even more surprising clue comes from a piece of the aircraft's debris. It's the cockpit table of one of the junior pilots. It's covered in anti-Key graffiti. One reads, "Key must go." Where? Down the drain. Another suggests, when Stanley Key dies, who will be God's next rep at BEA? Is this a clue to the real problem? Could the row over strike action have made Key's relationship with his young crew so bitter they simply weren't talking to each other?
In the hierarchical setup in that cockpit, challenging the captain was much more difficult than it is now.
We will never know if this is the truth.